And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Stripe Dev Chats. My name is Cecil Phillip, and as always, we're here to talk about all of the cool and amazing things that are happening inside of the world of Stripe. Now, today, Stripe's an API company, right? And so today, we're going to have a conversation about APIs. And I have my friend here, Danny, who's from a company called Fern, who builds developer tooling around APIs and makes it easier for folks to get jump started using HTTP APIs. So I'm really excited to talk to Danny about this. Danny, why don't we just start off with a quick introduction, right? Why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself? Tell us who you are and what do you do?
Cecil, thank you for having me here. My name is Danny. I was formerly a technical product manager at AWS, where I got to kind of grow up. And one of the things that is special about AWS is that APIs run the whole company. The entire customer experience is built around APIs. And one of the things that AWS did really, really well is that they offered SDKs in a lot of languages. And specifically, they were client SDKs so that you could call the AWS APIs from whatever language you were most comfortable with. And if you went to the documentation, you would see the client SDKs have examples throughout. So if you were a Python developer, it was really easy to navigate both the API documentation and then the Python SDK, and it felt like one experience. And Cecil, I was just really inspired by what AWS built. And so I decided to go start a company, and we call that company Fern. And we let engineering teams generate client SDKs for their API. So for example, a company with a public API can input their open API spec and offer their customers who are developers a Node.js, a Python, and a Java SDK in minutes. And that's what we do at Fern.
So like I said, I'm a big fan of APIs, and obviously Stripe is an API company. Like a lot of those things we do happen over APIs. So I'm definitely always interested with folks that are building tooling around making that workflow so much easier, right? Particularly with, I think about making APIs not only from the design of the APIs, like what does it look like? What is the structure? What are the response types? How do we deal with errors? But then also on the other side, well, how do the clients consume these APIs? Can we generate SDKs for them? How do we keep those SDKs up to date and versioned and so on and so forth, right? There's just so much stuff that has to happen in that world. And I definitely want to talk to you about that. We're going to get into that conversation. But first, I want to switch over to my screen. And what I want to do is let's go through some of the updates that have happened in the world of Stripe over the past week or so. So first update I want to share with folks, this is out of our newsroom. So if you head to stripe.com/newsroom, you're going to see this article or this piece of news that was posted. Airbnb partners with Stripe to power bank payments, which is really cool. And so what that means, and some folks might be like, what is this? Like, what are we talking about? Can't we pay Airbnb already? Today, right now, we've been powering their credit card story, but now we're going to be able to use bank payments as well, which is going to be really cool. So you can use, ACH debits, again, use your bank accounts, routing numbers and those types of things, and not just credit cards. So now you just have more ways to be able to integrate with Airbnb. So that's definitely going to be pretty fun. Next one I want to share with folks. So this week is Microsoft Build. For folks that don't know, that's Microsoft's big developer conference. Usually happens in Seattle. They're doing like a hybrid in-person virtual thing that's happening right now. But again, tons of announcements from the developer space coming out of Microsoft. But one of the things that I want to show, some folks on our team and also some folks over at Microsoft worked on this reference sample. So essentially, this is a real estate sample, I guess. And you can think about, how can I put together like a really large scale enterprise level real estate platform? And as you can see, like this is a very complicated diagram. The goal is not to have you look and read through this today, but again, like if you want to take a look through this, you can see how you can plug in things like API management and Azure Container Apps and Stripe and the developer CLI and VS Code and GitHub Actions and all these types of things to kind of make this entire picture, right? And I really like this because a lot of the times, we see demos that's like, let me show you the Hello World, the To-Do app demo, right? Like, let me show you the To-Do API, right? But like, no, this is a full-fledged app, right? Like using serverless and the cloud and Cosmos to be in tons of amazing stuff. So again, make sure you head over to techcommunity.microsoft.com and check that out. And again, this is their Contoso real estate sample. And this one's built with Node.js and Next.js and a bunch of other stuff. And one more quick shout out to one of our partners, Kenzie Dodds, who was at, I think it was the Remix conference the other day. He released this thing called the Epic Stack. I feel like every time Kent comes online, he has an announcement for a new stack that he's making. Anyway, so he's calling this the Epic Stack. Again, a lot of cool things in there, but obviously, like I kind of like it because it, there's some stripey stuff in here, right? So as you can see, there's Fly.io, there's Remix, there's Prisma, Tailwind CSS, so on and so forth. There's Playwright for doing testing, and again, there's also Stripe, a little bit of Stripe in there for doing the payment gateway, for the payments aspects of it. So again, definitely make sure you check that out if you're interested in trying to find like a full-fledged template sample, recommended practices of how to put together some large-scale JavaScript applications. And again, it includes testing and automation and deployments and all that types of stuff. That's all already bundled up for you. Definitely make sure you go ahead and check this out. Okay, enough of me. Done. No more updates.
As you like to say, this is the end of the Cecil show.
This is the end. This is the end of the Cecil show, right? This is the Danny show now. That's what we're gonna do. So Danny, I want to talk to you about Fern, but before that, I'd love to get a little bit of more of a background about you, right? Like, I'd love to know, how did you, what was your journey like that led you to building a company like Fern and wanting to create this open source project to help developers, make it easier for them to build APIs?
When I was coming out of undergrad at the University of Michigan, I got advice from a mentor who said, go start at a big company and then it's easier to get to a smaller one later.
Okay.
And little did I know how true that was. I think that one of the benefits of going to a company like AWS, that was my first job out of the workforce, entering the workforce. And it allowed me to see problems that were at a bigger scale and that had more investment behind them. And that were the solutions were thoughtfully architected because you had the time and resources to go build elegant solutions.
Right.
When I think about, in my mind right now, I'm thinking about gRPC that Google built, like an elegant way, right, to do server communication and a protocol and a serialization with proto buffers. But at Amazon, I got to see an elegant solution for how to design an API. So they do not use OpenAPI. They use a different way to define a schema for an API, and then they feed that into code generators that they've written at the company. And those code generators do three things, really. The first is that they generate server code. That, if you're familiar with server stubs, they generate server code for whoever is producing the API to get rid of some of the boilerplate that they would otherwise have to write by hand. Then they generate client libraries, or client SDKs, we'll call them today. And then lastly, they generate API documentation. And it just allows you to go from a single source, a schema of your API, to then generate multiple artifacts that all stay in sync. And Cecil, you were mentioning earlier versioning. Versioning APIs is tricky because you can version an API and then separately you can version your docs and your SDKs.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that's the wrong approach for most companies. What we've seen be very successful is when you version the API schema, so you're versioning how the server is behaving with docs and SDKs. So if you move from version 4 to version 5, everything changes a version number. And it makes it a lot easier for a external developer who might be a customer using your API to follow along and understand that the docs they're looking at are the same as this Node.js SDK that they're also looking at.
Yeah, you know what? When you say that, I think about like the complexity of trying to manage all of these separate versions, right? So kind of like you said, like there's the docs are versioned one way, and then the clients might be versioned one way, and then the API itself is versioned one way. And I've even seen APIs where the payload is versioned separately from the actual endpoints, right? So I might add a property, right? Let's say I add 2 properties, right? That's 2 plus version, hypothetically. And then I add 1 endpoint, that's what plus. So now my API endpoints, right, the actual available methods for me to call, and the actual payloads are versioned differently. And I'm just like, oh, what if this happen? And then we get into this whole thing about content negotiation and so on and so forth. and I'm not opposed to content negotiation, but I'm also a fan of simplicity. And I also think it makes sense to just have like a an overarching versioning system, right? So that I could say version 4 of the API includes SDKs and includes docs and includes the actual endpoints and the payloads and everything, and it's just one version. It just makes more sense.
There's a long running joke that your product mimics the organizational structure.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a good example where you might have a team internally that's responsible for building out the server behavior, right, and actually building out those functions. You might have a separate team responsible for documentation, like technical writers, and you might have another team like support engineers who are responsible for keeping the clients up to date.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I got to take away from AWS is they were like, it doesn't matter if there are different teams internally responsible for these different pieces. It's got to feel coherent.
Right.
And that cohesion between the different touch points was something that stuck with me. And so, like you said, I went out after Amazon to go start Fern. We are an open source developer tool. And we decided to go make APIs easier to use for every software company. You don't have to be someone like Amazon or even Stripe. Stripe also built some internal automation to keep docs and clients in sync. It's really expensive. I think, Cecil, maybe it'd be helpful for folks to talk about why people even care about client libraries. Do you think that'd be helpful?
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. And it's funny because I was having a conversation with another colleague at a different company just last week about this, and I'm like, for developers, standards are important, right? And I consider HTTP probably one of the most ubiquitous standards across computing, right? Like every programming language, most programming languages has an HTTP stack already built into it. Most of them can speak it from a client perspective. There's frameworks and all of these types of things that know how HTTP works. But then if that's the case, well, why do I need an SDK? Because if I could just speak HTTP, right, I should just be able to call it, right? Just like I can with curl or wget or anything like that. I don't need anything special. I could just use something that understands the standard. But then when it comes to certain languages and when it comes to the expected behavior, right, there might be certain patterns and practices that those languages adhere to, right? Like as example, as a .NET guy, right, like dependency injection is an important thing. Being able to inject and manage the lifetime and the memory of the connection and all this types of stuff is important, right? And so it's more than just me making the call, right? But I also want to manage the lifetime of that process. You know what I mean? I also don't want to have 20, 30 connections open because maybe I'm doing rapid succession, right? Like I want to have an efficient way to manage that. And so what I notice is a lot of client SDKs, again, based on the framework you're working on or whatever the case is, they'll add these extra niceties, right? Like these extra things that plug into your language or your framework or your platform or whatever it is you're using. That just makes sense.
A couple examples like auto pagination or auto retries.
Exactly. Paging, the retries, being able to deal with things like transient errors and things like that, right? And so this is where, for me, the SDKs come into play. Even when you think about authentication, right? Making sure that you include the right headers when you're sending the messages back and forth, right? I'm sure we could do it today without the SDK, but again, it's about being productive, right? And it's about having the developer not do so much work. And hey, if I'm using SDK X, you know what I mean? I just want to download a thing and get going, and I'm ready to go. Versus, okay, I gotta think about all of this other stuff, right, before I actually even start being productive with the thing that you're giving me to use.
And Cecil, when we think about why do I even care? What we've seen, and I've talked to now hundreds of leaders at companies that are API first.
Yeah.
And developer experience is top of mind for these companies with public facing APIs because they want to make it easy to get started quickly. And anytime their customer set spends either fighting bugs or figuring out how to use headers correctly is a distraction from getting live API calls into production.
Yeah. So Danny, why don't you tell us from Fern's perspective, what are some of the things that I guess the company offers, your toolkit offers, that actually makes it easier for developers?
Yeah, let's start with the world of SDKs. So I like to define my terms. It's one of the things I took away from Amazon. So companies release software development kits or SDKs to make it easier for developers to use an API,
Mhm.
offering support in a developer's language of preference used to require an SDK team. And that SDK team would be responsible for developing and maintaining the client SDKs in multiple programming languages. And what we've seen, what we are building with Fern is that you no longer need a team that's dedicated to keeping the Python SDK or your Node SDK or your Go SDK up to date. Instead, you should be using automation. And so at Fern, our top priority is producing idiomatic code. Cecil, one of the objections that I got early on running Fern, and we've been working on this open source project for 14 months now.
Mhm.
The first couple of months, by far the number one rejection I got when I was on phone calls was, Danny, I don't want auto-generated code I'm going to give to my customers. It's not going to be high enough quality.
Mhm.
I don't believe you that you can code gen the equivalence of what I would write by hand. I'd rather just put an engineer on it. And so that was the number one objection we had to go against. And
Mhm.
so we are really proud. We have chosen to do limited selection of SDKs you can generate with Fern, and that allowed us to be very high quality per SDK. And so today we support TypeScript or JavaScript in our Node.js SDK. We
Mhm.
support Java, we support Python, and we are in private beta for Go that will be coming out later this year.
Nice. Nice. And I'm here, and I got your documentation website up as you're talking, and so I can see, like you said, you do the SDKs, but then there's also some server side code generation. Could you talk to me about that a little bit? What's involved in the server side piece of it?
Yeah, this came from technology that existed at Palantir. So my two co-founders, Zach and Deep, spent years at Palantir as software engineers. And one of the things they did really well was you would start with a schema to describe your API. So this is schema first API design. And then you would use that to generate server boilerplate code. And that server boilerplate code looks like your networking logic, your models. And as an engineer, you would just be responsible for writing your business logic or your application logic. And so it reduces the number of lines of code that an engineer needs to write in order to get an API live. And so that's the server side code generation.
But
Similar
now,
to server stubs in the
yeah,
world of OpenAPI or Swagger.
but I can imagine now the server side that has to be such a high, like there's just so many options, right? Like if I think about Node.js, I think about Python, I think about Ruby and .NET, right? Like there's so many different web frameworks. So I'm guessing out of the box, you probably have like a standard set, obviously working with the open source community that you support. And then, obviously if folks want more, right? I'm sure they could submit GitHub issues or send PRs, right? And be able to add some of that support.
Cecil, I mean, you nailed it. Like we started with Express, we
Mm-hmm.
started with Java Spring Boot, and we also focused on Fast API. We
Nice.
get requests for things like Django and Flask and .NET, and today we do not support generating those frameworks or platforms.
Right.
Over time, we will expand what we can do, but you're exactly right. Quality is more important than quantity from our customers.
That's for sure, for sure. All right, so I'm gonna click on this showcase thing real quick. Let's see. Let's go to I'm gonna go to the Express one, right? And it looks like you got a little demo here. So, folks, if you want to, I'm not gonna play this demo, but for folks, if you wanted to, you can head over. I'm on docs.buildwithfern.com, and at the left side they have like a little showcase. You can see what the Express and the Fast API samples look like. Yeah, it looks like you guys allow the definitions using like a YAML file, right? And I'm guessing this is, let's see. Okay, so this allows you to define like the base path, the parameters, the properties. So I'll be honest with you. You know what's cool about this is that this is the first time that I'm looking at this schema, the first time I'm looking at this document, and I really tell exactly what's happening here, right?
Cecil, why don't I quiz you a little bit? If we look at that, the response is a movie. What do you expect to get back in a movie object?
Right. So I'm guessing the movie is going to have an ID and a title. And then it looks like, yeah, there's a rating, a movie rating that's of type double. and it looks like there's going to be some documentation. I'm going to guess the docs is not actually going to be returned, but I'm guessing it's just like some metadata that's
That's exactly
associated with
right.
that
What we
API.
do is we put those docs into your SDK so that as a comment above that type, above that property. And
Got
then
it.
we also put it into your API documentation, whether you use a provider like README or Stoplight or Gitbook or Mintlify. We integrate with these docs providers so
Oh,
that
nice.
you can ensure that you can really have one source of truth for your API that is reflected in other places like docs.
Right. So then, like you're kind of showing here, so I can either give just like the basic type, like again like string, and I'm guessing movie ID is. I'm guessing movie ID is defined in here somewhere, is it?
It is right under types. We can see the
There we
movie
go.
is a string.
Oh, there we go. So like you have like I'm guessing this is like a top level type, right? And then or kind of like a type alias to some extent. And then now we can have not only the type definitions, but then also the docs and other metadata associated to each property of this object that's in here as well.
Yep. And that movie ID is like when developing, it's really easy if you have a bunch of UUIDs, for example,
Yeah.
to put the wrong one in the wrong place as a developer. And so we cast it with this like movie ID so that we're expecting a movie ID here. And as a developer, it's less error prone.
Nice. Nice. But yeah, like I said, this is the first time I'm reading this doc, right? It looks actually super readable. Obviously, no crazy magic, right? Like, I feel like I know exactly what's happening here. And then looks like you all have a CLI, right? So I can do like a Fern generate, and then
This is the primary way that folks interact with Fern is through the Fern CLI.
okay. So then I run Fern CLI against this YAML, and then if, for instance, we were using Fast API, this is an example of something it would generate, right? Like something like this.
You nailed it.
Yeah, this is awesome, right? And so, kind of like what you were saying before, you're not necessarily generating the API and the implementation of the API, but like more so you're just generating the stubs, right? Like here's the endpoints, here's the URLs, here's the routes that you'd probably want to hit, but the actual business layer of it, right? Like the objects of it, it's still up to developers have to develop, right? Like we still have to write the code, but at least in terms of the getting started experience, right? My time to productivity is shorter because now all I got to do is like insert here, right, and then fill it out.
Cecil, one of the biggest questions I get is this using generative AI or LLMs under the hood?
Oh, is it?
Given that we are doing code generation, it's a common question. And the answer is no.
No. Okay.
For our users and our open source community, there are two things that are really important. Precision, which means I want the code to work when it's generated.
Yeah.
Like it has to work. And then second, determinism, which is if every time I run this Fern generate command, I get a different output, then like my SDK can change on my customers.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a lot of churn and a negative developer experience.
Right.
So we have written a proprietary rule-based engine. Mm-hmm. You can check it out. It's open source.
Okay.
And maybe this would be a good time to actually go check out what that repo looks like too.
Sure. So I'm guessing I'm going to head over to github.com, and I'm guessing it's just Fern, or is it built with Fern?
It'll be Fern-API.
Fern.
Fern.
All right, great. Here we go. And then what I'll do as well, since we're in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to throw this up on the screen. So folks that are watching, whether you're watching live now or watching later, you can go ahead and check this out. All right. So I'm going to guess that it is the Fast API starter. Is that what we're?
Let's go ahead into that would be a starter repo for someone who wants to have a back end and a front end that's already set up. But if we just go into that Fern repo listed at the top of the repos list. Yep.
Okay.
This is the open source repo. It's got maybe if you scroll up, it's got a couple of commits, I think. Yeah, like 1,300 there.
Yeah.
So this is the benefit of working on something for 14 months with 3 of us.
Yeah. Looks like we've been making commits as we've been live right now. So there you
go. It's pretty special when our customers can see the progress that we're making. It's something that I've never experienced before in my business life.
Yeah.
Just having it's kind of like having my Asana or my Monday open to the world. They can see all the work that I've been doing.
Yeah, this is beautiful. And I love that it's like you said, like it's open source. First can kind of come in and see what's happening. There's no magic under the hood, right? And if there's something that you'd like to see, something that's missing, additional features, right? Like that's the beauty of GitHub, right? Like that's what issues are for. That's what pull requests are for. And we could all just be better together, right? Like as we continue to make, these type of projects.
And it keeps improving. So I think we've got 11 contributors there.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the deal, Cecil. If someone who's watching this can make a contribution, it could be an improvement to a README or some code. I will send you a Fern in the next day if anyone watching this goes ahead and joins and becomes our 12th contributor.
Are you serious? I'm going to find something to commit tonight. You know that,
exactly.
Right? That's what I'm going to do. I want you to send me a Fern, Danny. And if you send me a Fern, I will put it in this office right here. It's going to be the backdrop of every stream I do. If you do that,
I'll take that to the bank.
But you know what that means? That means I got to take care of it too. So if it dies on stream,
I'll see it.
That would be a problem. So that's going to put me. That's going to make sure I stay accountable. Make sure I'm taking care of business.
Yeah, Cecil, if we're able to go back, I think one tab here in the browser.
Sure.
I would love to go to comparing this with OpenAPI, because I think some listeners might say, hey, isn't OpenAPI the place where we can define what an API contract is and then use that as an input to some code generators? And the answer is yes, but. And I think that scrolling through, for example, the simplicity, I like the examples here of Fern versus OpenAPI. And one of the things that I believe is that the number of software developers that will exist in the next 5 years is growing really quickly.
Yeah.
And the number of unsophisticated software engineers is growing really quickly. So the simpler we can make things, the more accessible they are for every engineer out there, even the ones who have a couple of months of experience right now. And so a discriminated union in Fern, we can talk through this a little bit or just look at the number of lines of code to say, hey, I'm going to return you an animal. You pass me a pet type, and it'll either be this dog object or this cat object. Mm. And if we were going to do that in OpenAPI, polymorphism and union types are just not a first-class concept. And we can scroll down a little bit more to see what this would look like. The equivalent code in a different standard in OpenAPI. And Cecil, you tell me what you think is easier for a developer of 3 months to understand.
Yeah, I was just like, oh, we're still going. We're still going. We're still going. Yeah, I think outside of just the length of the documents, if you think about like the readability of it. So for instance, there's this ref thing. Like at first glance, I don't know what this is. I'm going to have to like.
I would chat GPT, like what is, ref and
figure out and try and figure it out. It says one of ref, right? So as an example, like off the top of my head, I'll be like, this part's already confusing. This is what, like line 3 and 4 of the document versus up here. I'm just like, okay, animal union of dog and cat, got it. Dog has these things, cat has these things, got it. You know what I mean? And then we're done and we kind of move on with life.
So Cecil, when we came out of both Amazon and Palantir, where my team came from before starting Fern, both companies rejected OpenAPI and Swagger and decided to build their own interface definition language, or IDL, to describe an API. Amazon's was called Smithy, and Palantir's was called Conjure. Both are open source projects also.
Okay.
Very little community activity. Smithy. And one of the things that we took away was, if you have an open source project, community's front and center. Like That's we view the community and being both responsive to the community's needs as like part of the product that we are offering is support to the community. And for us, that's via Discord.
Yeah. And then I know you sent me the Discord link too. So what I'll do, I'll pull up the link here at the bottom of the screen. So if folks are interested and you want to join the folks at Fern over on Discord, make sure you go ahead and, copy paste this link. You know what I'll actually do too? I'll put it in the comment section. So the folks that are here hanging out with us live across YouTube, Twitch, and LinkedIn, feel free to try that link out. And hopefully we'll see you in there. I'm already in there. So, hopefully feel free to come in and send me a ping or send me a message or whatever.
Fantastic. And I think the last thing on this docs that would be helpful is like, okay, if I want to use this, Cecil, how do I actually get started?
Yeah. And so now I'm going to click on this get started thing. Okay. So npm install, sure, that makes sense.
It makes sense given that we are a CLI.
Fern in it.
Install the CLI, run some Fern init, and then you've got a bootstrapped API that'll actually work, and you can generate code on. We call it the IMDb API, which is what we reviewed earlier. Just a really simple API.
Gotcha.
Now, but some folks already have an open API spec.
Mm-hmm.
And Cecil, I'll talk about one of our customers. Their name is Vellum. They are also a Y Combinator company, which we'll get to talk about later in this, what the Y Combinator experience was like.
Yeah.
But they use Django as their server framework, and their Django layer generates an open API spec for them automatically. So they go server code to open API, and then using the Fern CLI and their CI/CD, they then pass us the open API and generate code.
Oh, that's amazing. So like once the API is built, like it's just generation all the way through, right? Like so the Django generates the open API, and then now Fern or your tools could just look at that spec and then just generate clients for said programming languages after that.
That's exactly right. So we see two approaches here. It's like, do you want to start with a schema to describe your API? Again, this is what Palantir and Amazon decided to do as the companies. Or alternatively, you can just start in code, and you can go from code into a schema. And so there are two approaches. The one that we see more CTOs and the head of engineering directing their teams toward is the schema first approach. Because like what we're looking at now on your screen of this example API, if I want my product manager, my backend engineer, and my front-end engineer to get in a room and talk about what the API is, it's a lot easier for me to talk about this file that we're looking at than to talk about some Go code, where the front-end engineer is like, show me TypeScript, please.
This is interesting.
We're seeing API design become, it used to be just the backend engineers were responsible for building the API, but with more and more API-first companies, it's becoming a collaborative activity where product managers and front-end engineers are more involved.
And again, like I'm just reading through this stuff, like it looks pretty straightforward, right? Like there's not a lot of crazy stuff going on. Super readable. And like you said, now like this could just generate my, my server-side code. And then I think I also saw that you guys generate Postman collections too.
Yeah. We love Postman. We are very lucky that the CEO and founder, Abhinav, actually backed us as a company.
Oh, nice.
Which is pretty awesome. And so for us, generating a Postman collection, which is a collection.json file, is something that you get out of Fern. So again, it's like describe your API once and then tell us the destinations, which might be your API documentation. It might be Postman. It might be client libraries. But where would you like that API to be reflected?
Oh, that's amazing. Okay.
Cecil, I've got something that's on my mind.
Tell me. What's going on?
When I talk to leaders at API first companies, you know what company comes up that they want to be like?
Fern?
They actually want to be like Stripe.
Get out of here.
They're like, I want a Stripe-like developer experience. Huh. And you know what I say to him, Cecil? Like, unpack that for me. Like, peel back the onion. Like,
yeah, like what does that mean? Like, what are the things? What are the components that makes up that experience? I'd be super curious.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna share with you some of the things that I've heard. Again, these are from mostly head of engineerings and CTOs of companies that are API first. So their primary way that their customers interact with them is via an API. Mm-hmm. And I think there are three components of Stripe's developer experience if I thought about it like a recipe. And the first is around browsing it. Mm-hmm. The second is around trying it. Mm-hmm. And the third is around integrating with it. And so, Cecil, are you up to start with? We can talk about what browsing it looks like.
Well, let's do it. Right.
All right. I'm putting myself in the shoes of a developer. I've just landed on a new company's API. I've never seen it before, similar to how you were on the Fern docs. Mm-hmm. The first thing that I'm doing is I'm going to the API documentation. I want to see, like, what can I do, right? That's like my first, like, what is this for?
Sure. And you know what I'll do? And while you say that, why don't I go ahead and bring up the Stripe API docs since that's what we're talking about?
Perfect. Let's do it.
I'm going to go to stripe.com/docs. I could type /API, right?
So like the first thing on my mind is like, what is the functionality of this thing? Great. And it's telling me, okay, you can expect REST and we've got this test mode. Okay, great. Now on the left, I'm going to core resources. And if I'm going to like charges, that's where I'm clicking. If I'm looking at this, I'm like, I get the concept of a payment charge. Sure. So like, what am I looking at here? One of the patterns that we've seen is that the more experienced developers that we work with don't start in API docs. That it's one of the patterns that it's more for entry level to middle. It can absolutely range, but the most advanced engineers that I've worked with, they actually would go to GitHub right now. And so if you're up for it, let's go to GitHub.
Oh, really? Huh.
Go to like Stripe Node. That's where they would start.
All right. Oops. Hold on. Let me deal with this real quick.
You got it.
I forgot I had this single sign-on thing turned on. Boom. There we go. Fantastic. All right. So we're at github.com/stripe.
And let's say I'm an engineer. It's like, you know how I want to learn about what the API functionality is? I want to learn that by looking through code. And so I'm going to go in here and I'm going to start exploring. I want to probably go to the definition and explore the API like I would any other library.
Right.
And I could even do this in my IDE, right, in my editor.
Yeah.
And so we've seen that there are kind of two ways that folks like to browse what an API can do. The first being API documentation, and the second being the SDK. They will tend to come to GitHub, and then they want to get into their code editor. So they would add it as a library that's a dependency and start playing around with it. And they would like see the autocomplete. So they would do stripe dot, and they'd be like, what are
the options that I have from this point?
Yeah, what are the resources and what are the operations? What can I do to them?
You know, one of the things I like to do too is like when I come in and look at a library like this, I'll hit the dot, like I'll hit the dot in GitHub, right? And so for folks that don't know, if you just come to GitHub and you just hit dot, right? You just hit like that period sign. Now it's going to pull up an instance of VS Code, and in not too long, takes a second or two, but now I have like the navigation keys of VS Code, right? So now I feel a little bit better. I could, hit the thing. I could hit an index. I could look at these tests. I could pull up types. I could move around and I could start navigating.
Yeah. Do we have definition here?
Yeah. So we have different rich source definitions. Let's go to the definition for charges. This is a TypeScript definition file. So as you can see, like we can see the interfaces and obviously there's the documentation.
But this is a great example. If we look at let's look at line 41, for example. We've got documentation showing up in comments. And the question is, Cecil, how does Stripe do that? How do they get this comment into their SDK? And the answer is through CodeGen.
Yeah.
This is not manually. Every time that comment changes, they're not going to each SDK and changing it. These are the benefits of having a single source of truth and being able to reflect that across multiple different artifacts like SDKs and docs.
Yeah. Okay. So again, we check GitHub.
Yep.
We look at the API docs. All right. What else would I do as a developer that's trying to learn?
And this is all still in the browse it category. The next thing I might want to do is just walk through a sample app.
Sure.
And so I'm.
Not sure where Danny went, but I guess I'll just keep talking until he comes back. Oh, here he is.
We're back.
back.
I'm going to pass you a link to one of Fern's customers.
Okay, got it.
This is a company called Flatfile, and they do CSV importing. They're a bunch of data nerds. They're great. And one of the things that we can see here is that if we scroll down a bit, we're going to see. Well, actually, let's scroll to the top. Sorry to move you around, Cecil, on the screen. But we can see that their SDK was updated by the Fern API bot. Mm-hmm. So they do not manually maintain this SDK. 4 hours ago, a bot went ahead and updated it because they had changes to their API.
Right.
And then if we scroll down, we can actually see that there's going to be a link. It tells us how to install it. It tells us how to use it. And then we actually have a link to open it up in StackBlitz.
Okay.
And if you're up for it, I would love to open that up together.
Yeah, StackBlitz is good.
What this is showing is this is a sample app. So they're saying, hey, here's our SDK. If you want to see what it's like to use it, you can go in here, and we've built an application that consumes that SDK and takes it on as a dependency. We can see that in the first line here. And so this is the last part of browsing it. We've seen it become a very common pattern where folks want to get into a sample app really quickly. Get a sense of, how would I use this?
Right. Okay.
And it's nice. They've got some comments like, hey, here's how you create the new client. And then here are examples of how you could call that client.
Right. Boom. So we can see it. We can see they have some workbooks.
Yep.
Right.
And all of this is just a sample. And they would do this across languages. So they do this in Python, and they do this in C#.
Nice. Okay.
All right. So now that we've gone through the browse it part of the Stripe recipe, and Stripe nails this with docs, SDKs in multiple programming languages, the next piece of the recipe is trying it. And so, Cecil, I think you could talk about the test environment and how Stripe has done a great job. They don't just have a mock server where it kind of echoes static responses, but you can actually try the Stripe API, the full functionality, while testing it out.
Yeah, you can. And then there's actually two things I wanted to point out from that perspective. So if we head over to stripe.com/docs, and not DCS, docs, right? If we head over to stripe.com/docs and we go to payments, one of the things that I like to show folks right here, these are some of our quick starts. If I click this one that says accept online payments, what I love about this page is that I'm not signing in right now, but one of the things I love about this page is that I could kind of build my own adventure, so to speak. So let's say I wanted to do, I don't know, React in the front end, Python in the back end. Let's say I wanted to do that, or even a Next.js one, or whatever the case is. And I could start clicking around, and now this thing is going to generate a sample for me. And now, as I'm done, I could just hit download, and it'll actually download the code, and I could just run it on my machine. And it even tells me how to run it too. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom, see, it'll give me the command to actually start running the thing, right? So in terms of, again, just being able to start really quickly, that's a good example. But like you said, when I'm running this, I actually am calling the API, right? And one of the things that we do have, and I'll search for this inside of the docs as we're in here, is, we have test mode, right? And now the cool thing about test mode is that you could create all of the different objects of Stripe, customers, products, charges, different prices, whatever the case is, and it'll never affect your production. Right, you could just kind of create stuff. You can delete them. You could try things out. You can actually make real API calls and not get charged any money in test mode. But now you kind of understand what the results look like, what the errors look like. What do my webhooks look like when they're firing events and stuff like that. And it just gives you a really easy way to get started before you start to before you go live and before you actually start sending and receiving real money.
But Cecil, this is a great example of innovations that came out of Stripe. Like that previous screen we were on where you get to choose your stack and it gives you different code depending on your choices.
Yeah,
it's a great example of an innovation that is not productized. Stripe has not allowed any other API first company to use this. And so at Fern, we are really motivated by the idea of let's take this and bring it to the rest of the API economy. There are thousands of companies that would benefit from having an experience like this, and they can't afford a development team to go build it out internally.
Are you trying to tell me that you built this? Is that what
we have not built it yet, but...
Okay. You have me scared for a second. I was just like, this is going to be one of those Oprah moments where you're like, surprise! Look under your chair. Guess what you got today?
I'm really proud that we have taken API code gen. We've started with code gen, but there's so much more for us to build. And so in terms of the try it to the recipe of what Stripe's done well, we talked about browsing an API, then trying the API, and this is all part of that experience. The next part is typically what we've seen is someone writes a Slack message to their other engineers on their team. And they're like, hey, I'm planning on using this new API that I found. They might throw a sample app and they might give a couple of bullet points of justification, or they'll write a full tech doc and they'll actually write a 1 or a 2 pager about why they want to use this API. And let's assume that that conversation goes well, Cecil, and they get a thumbs up from the leaders of the organization. They say, go ahead and integrate with that API. Like, what happens next?
Okay.
And the answer is that they probably go to some guides. These are written by a human. These are not auto-generated. They're really contextual. Stripe does a great job of this. It's like, here's the outcome you're looking to achieve, and here are the steps you can take to go get there. And then we tend to see them pick up an SDK. Right. And now they're actually going to use the SDK to build the integration. And they will never interact with the API directly. They'll interact with a layer on top of the API, which is the SDK. And they'll typically pull it down from the registry like NPM or Maven or PyPy. And then they will depend on that as they go and build their application.
Right.
But
Ryan, like, I've been just listening to you, and I don't know, I'm just so pumped and excited to really try out Fern out. Not only because of what you guys are doing right now, but even what you're looking to do in the future. And I have to ask you this question, right? Because I know you came out of, your company came out of Y Combinator. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to know, like, while you were in that experience, was there something there that really, like, made you, I don't know, like, made you really, like, dig in 10 toes down and, like, really push and fight to make the product what it is today? Like, was there something there that really helped mold the work ethic, right, and the pride and the energy that you put into this company?
Yeah. So let's talk about Y Combinator for a minute. It is the best place in the world to go build a developer tool. The reason for that is that you have early stage companies who are willing to take risks with their tech stack and bet on emerging technology that has not been battle tested. And that described us when we were entering Y Combinator. We weren't even a year old. We had customers, we had production use cases, but anyone that started using us, they were taking a risk. And we take that risk with some of our colleagues who are in Y Combinator. Yeah. But what Y Combinator opened for us were businesses with challenges that were able to move quickly. And I think, like, those two components are probably the most valuable. You need people with the problem, and having people with the problem who need to solve it by next week allowed us to focus our time on hands-on deployments.
Yeah.
So, Cecil, this might be a good time to talk about how we structure our company at Fern.
Yeah, let's do that.
So we're an open source project and we are a company. And the way that we've structured ourselves is that we have 3 different teams at the company. And right now there are 3 employees. So it fits very nicely as a 1-to-1 ratio. But as we grow, we will hire in 3 different areas. The first, and I'll start on the products, is product development. And this is building out core functionality. A good example would be us writing a Go SDK generator.
Right.
Like, that is product work that needs to be done. The second bucket is what we call forward deployed engineering, which is you are going to go take this Fern toolkit and you are going to deploy it with our next customer. Very hands-on with the customer, and you are responsible from getting them from interested to live. And we call that forward deployed engineering.
Right.
And the last bucket is sales and business development. And this is, you have to go tell the world. This is a great example, being here with you, Cecil. You got to go tell the world about what you're building, drive distribution, and get folks interested. And so my job on the team is to make that forward deployed engineer too busy to have time to sleep. Because there's so many people that want to use Fern that we're like bottlenecked on getting them onboarded.
That's crazy.
And then that forward deployed engineer has to go make requests of the product team to say, hey, my customers that I'm working with need another thing. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, they need Django server-side code generation, or they need API documentation. And so, Cecil, I'm wondering if we can do a bit of a sneak peek on this call together of the the first view of Fern's API documentation product that's been publicly released.
Have you? Can we? Let's do it.
If you're cool with it.
Yeah, let's do it. Why not?
All right. Earlier, I told you, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Sure. And I'll pull it up.
Earlier, I told you that the number one request that we got from our customers is, I want to be more like Stripe. And one of the ways that they requested that is with API documentation. Right. So can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see a screen right now.
All right, cool. This is a design preview of what Fern's API documentation offering looks like.
Nice.
So we can see some getting started and some introduction. And the way that we structure this is that those are Markdown or MDX files that are versioned in Git, and that our customers would be responsible for writing. And then everything under the core resources, and again, this is very much inspired by what Stripe has. You first describe the object, and then you describe the operations or the things that the verbs you can do with that object. And what I want to show here is that we are the first API documentation provider in the world that is SDK aware. And what that means is that you can go ahead and select your language of the client you want to use, and you can get a code snippet that's in that language that you can drop right into your editor. So this is something that Stripe and AWS and Twilio have built for themselves, but there is no productized version of this experience that a startup can go use to have their client SDKs and their docs cohesively in one experience. And with Fern, you can scroll through your documentation. It's got this nice responsive interface. And when you highlight over a property, we can see on the right that we actually will show you via syntax highlighting where in the response JSON that specific property is. So we've got some customers that have hundreds of lines of JSON when they return an object. And it's nice to be able to figure out, okay, in this example, where is this patient property within this response? So this is the first release of what the Fern docs look like that we've had.
I mean, these look really good. No doubt about it. These look really good. And I also gotta say, I'm flattered, I guess. I didn't build our API docs, but I gotta say I'm flattered. You know what? I love seeing the community being inspired by each other. You know what I mean? And not only just being inspired by each other, but pushing all of us to like be better and do more. You know what I mean? So I love how you took something that you saw and now you've been inspired by it, and then now you're trying to like level it up. You know what I mean? I think that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you very much. It's one of the learnings that I had. It's one of these things you only learn from talking to a lot of customers. But initially, I thought we were going to be the team that does SDK generation. And just get really good at that. Right. And what I learned from talking to customers is that actually API documentation is more important to them. SDKs are a secondary concern after, like, API documentation is a requirement. SDKs are a nice to have. Yeah. And so that led us to decide that we need to offer an API documentation experience. And what differentiates it is that the client SDKs are a first-class concept that are cohesively integrated.
And you know what? That makes a lot of sense, because as I think about it, the thing that developers like writing the least are tests and docs.
Tests
and docs. The two things that are going to get written the last are tests and docs. And so again, like if these are things that you can help bootstrap, you know what I mean? Not that we want to encourage lazy developers, but if these are things that we can bootstrap and again make our time to productivity faster, then like I'm all for it. I think that's amazing.
And the sales and the business development team really cares about docs, because that's basically how you demo an API. You spend more time in docs than you do in code.
You do, because now it's about capabilities, right? Like, what are the capabilities of this API? How do I show them off to you? How do I turn them on and off, right? Like, how do I see what the shape of the resulting type is, right?
And when I navigate the Stripe docs, I'm like, wow, this is a really high pedigree engineering culture.
Yeah.
And like, why do you feel that way? And you're not making any API calls. It's the feel of the docs. And so we've decided to go bring that to every software development team in the world who's building an API product.
Yeah, that's amazing. No, that's amazing, dude. Oh my gosh. All right, Danny, we are running low on time. I really feel like you and I could keep talking for like a long time. But I really appreciate you coming on and not only talking to us about Fern, but showing us like where the future is going. Like I'm really excited to get my hands on that thing whenever you decide to make it public and release it. Um, if there's one thing that you want folks to do now that they've seen this conversation and they've gotten a little bit of a taste of what Fern is capable of, what would that one thing be?
I would like folks to star us on GitHub. We're an
Okay.
open source project and would love to see more stargazers out there supporting.
Okay. And then I'm going to pull up the GitHub repo. So I'm going to pull it up right now. So github.com/fern-api, right? So that's the top level organization. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start.
We have these are the cool things about being a developer tool is Cecil, we've built a Zapier Slack integration. So every time someone stars our repo, we get notified and it tells us their GitHub account. And then anytime that anyone runs into an error with our CLI, we also get notified. And so we can proactively within a couple of minutes being like, hey, Cecil, I saw that you ran into an error using the Fern CLI. This might resolve it. And so it's just great being a developer tools company. Our kind of notification hub is Slack. And so I hope that there are a lot of notifications like the one I'm getting from Cecil starring the repo of other folks out there.
But you know what, it even goes beyond just making a good developer product. I mean, that's like caring about your community, right? Like that is such a like I mean you got to have soul, right? Like you have to have a soul to want to do those types of things, right? And I find like a lot of companies we think about APIs as products, then we think about our customer as just as just people that pay us. But when we really care about we care about our community, we care about the people that are around us. Like we do stuff like that, right? Like we make sure that, hey, let me make sure that I can get all the information I can to give you the best possible answer I can, versus just, oh, I'm just gonna send you the FAQ and tell you to call somebody else. You know what I mean? Like that's a different approach, right? And so I really like what you guys are doing.
We will only win as a company if we successfully build a vibrant community.
Yeah.
Most of them will be free tier users of Fern, and they're going to help us expand the number of languages we offer. I think of things like Swift and Flutter and Elixir, and like they're kind of longer tail languages for us compared to Node and Python.
Yeah.
The way that we're going to get there is through help from the community.
It is. Well, Danny, again, thank you so much for coming on, man. Again, I'm a fan. I love what you guys are doing, and definitely looking forward to like some of those updates that you shared with us a little while ago.
Thank you. The last thing on my end is if anyone needs client libraries for their API, please reach out to me, Danny@buildwithfern.com.
Danny@buildwithfern.com. There you go, folks. So make sure you hit up Danny. Remember to go check out not only their GitHub repo, but also their Discord. And obviously head over to buildwithfern.com, right? And try it out, and then let Danny and his team know how you think about it. That being said, thank you so much for joining us. This has been another episode of Stripe Dev Chats. My name is Cecil Phillip. Appreciate you all so much, and we'll see you all again next time. Bye, everybody.